Welcome to a special Saturday night scary stories stream. I got a bunch of cryptid creepies for you folks tonight. But I'd like to start by answering a question someone asked a while back that I lost somewhere in the comments section. They asked how my interest in all this weird stuff started. Had I seen a cryptid myself and all that? Well, no. I've never seen a Dogman or a Bigfoot or anything of that nature. My excuse is that I live in New York City, so how could I see one of those things? But I was reminded recently of a story my late father used to tell me about the time when he was convinced he saw a werewolf, and this was in the Bronx. I told this story a long time ago on this show, but I couldn't find my original recording or script, so I'm going to have to retell it from scratch and hope I get it right. This was the mid-1950s. My father was a young guy, maybe 20, and he was new at driving a cab. It was the full moon on a cold night in the Bronx, and when a certain call came in, the dispatcher and his friends started chuckling among themselves. Then they called my dad over, who was a big Irishman, bigger than I ever got to be, and they told him to go pick up someone that they said was a regular customer. This guy would only call for a cab once a month, and he always wanted to be taken to the same place. My dad was warned to treat this guy well, as he was a regular paying customer. Whatever he wanted, just do your best to accommodate. Okay, fine. So my big fearless father drives out to the address he was given, and he picks up this scrawny, short, ratty looking guy. He gets in wearing a scowl, and he sits there wearing a scowl. My father asks him where to, and the guy gives him the address for Woodlawn Cemetery. Now, it was after dark, and my father was pretty sure that Woodlawn Cemetery wasn't going to be open at that hour. He started to say something like that to the little emaciated-looking guy, and that guy shut my father up with a growl about how he should do his job if he wanted to earn his keep. So my father shut up, and he drove as quickly as he legally and safely could toward the requested destination. Meanwhile, the guy in the back seat was getting tenser and tenser, making this sound that wasn't far off from a growl. So finally my father pulled up to the corner of Woodlawn Cemetery in the middle of the night, and the guy jumped out of the back of the cab. He went running to the fence around that graveyard, and somehow this little weak-looking guy climbed and vaulted the fence with very little effort, disappearing somewhere inside. I would always ask, where'd he go next? To which my father told me he didn't care. I asked him, didn't he want his fare? That guy didn't pay his fare. But to my father, that guy was a werewolf. He needed to get to the cemetery at night during the full moon. Therefore, he was a werewolf, and there was no questioning this fact. At least as far as my father was concerned. He didn't care that he didn't get paid. He learned a life lesson, which is, be careful who you let into your cab on the night of the full moon in the Bronx. We got a boatload of weird and wonderful Dogman and Cryptid tales coming up, so I hope you can stick around. And now, let's begin.
Welcome to Scary Stories, the channel that tells you scary stories.
Dogman slept in our basement, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. Our family hardly ever took vacations when I was young, but one year we went away for a full 6 weeks. My father left one of his friends from the city in charge of our house. He didn't know how to drive, so he basically had food delivered the entire time and never left the place. He also got so certain that it was crime-free out in the country that he kept forgetting to lock up the house or the outside entrance to the basement. He was right about the crime out where I grew up. It's practically non-existent. But he was silly to think that nature wouldn't crawl into every single cavity or opening left available to it. And so, when we got back, there was a large nest of hornets just inside the entrance to our garage. Dad's friend had never opened the door once, and the yellow jackets just swarmed in and took the place over. My parents had to call for some expensive guys to come out and deal with that. In the meantime, they couldn't use the garage for 3 days or however long it took for the people to come out. That was one problem. The other problem was even more dangerous than the first one, although the solution was a lot less expensive. Let me tell you about it since I'm the one who discovered it. Our house had 2 main floors. Downstairs had the kitchen, dining room, and a TV room that looked out onto the forest just 50 or 60 feet past the windows. Upstairs had bedrooms and bathrooms and a chain hanging from the ceiling. You could pull down on that and a staircase would appear so you could go up to the tiny 4-foot-tall attic. We also had a basement, but there was no way to enter it from within the house. You had to go out and walk around to the side of the house hidden by tall hedges that nearly stretched up to the bottom of the second-story bedroom windows. There, at your feet, would be a diagonal double door which, when opened, revealed old concrete steps leading down to the old, cool cellar. I think in the olden days it had been used to keep food cool, and in fact we had 4 large freezers storing enough food to last a year into the next nuclear Armageddon. Or if the end of the world turns off the electricity, about a day into the next nuclear Armageddon. So, like the second or third day we were back, my father decided he was going to risk the hornets and barbecue some dinner. It was about 6:30 or 7 maybe, but was still going to be light for some time. He asked me to go into the basement and pull up some ribs for him to grill. I was happy to oblige. I love ribs, even to this day. So I traipsed down into the basement, la-di-da, and as soon as I got down there, I could smell something really terrible. I got nervous that the freezers had gotten unplugged or turned off, but I could hear them humming. I inspected the one nearest to me and it seemed fine. I wasn't seeing any meat taken out, I wasn't seeing any blood on the floor, but I was smelling something that was sort of a combination of a wet dog and something that had died. I walked deeper into the basement, observing the second freezer. It seemed fine as well. The ribs were in the furthest freezer. I was already worried that we weren't going to have ribs to barbecue when I heard a sound. It was the sound of something moving somewhere in the darkness off in front of me. I figured it was a rat or a mouse or a mole, as we had all 3 in the forest around us. It seemed impossible to keep them out, as they were able to chew new holes each time an old one was sealed. I wished I had hard boots on instead of sneakers, but I advanced toward the sound anyway. I would shoo the rat off, then get the ribs, if the ribs weren't what was making this terrible smell. I passed the 3rd freezer, and it too was humming along and seemed fine. The odor was getting so intense that I was beginning to get nauseous. I remember I pulled my t-shirt up around my nose and my mouth, and I twisted it around tight like a kind of air filter. It still smelled terrible. I stomped on the ground before approaching the final freezer. "You better run off, Mr. Mouse or Rat or whatever you are," I shouted toward the darkness where I had heard the noise. "I'm just coming to get some stuff out of that there box. I'll be gone in a second, then you can go back to your rat business. Is it a deal?" I was acting brave, but I was really hoping it would run off without me having to see it, whatever it was. I am very grossed out by rodents. Whenever any of us told our parents we saw them in the basement, our parents would make us bait and lay traps for them. It was nightmarish, just disgusting. So the other reason I was hoping the mouse or rat would run away before I saw it was that if I didn't see it, then I wouldn't be lying when I told my parents that I hadn't seen any rodents when I was in the basement this time. See how that works? So I didn't hear anything from beyond the freezer. I knew that whatever it was had to still be back there, so I shouted, "Go on, get out," and stomped on the concrete floor with my sneaker again. Nothing. Cautiously, I took a step forward and kicked the freezer as hard as I could. Then I jumped back, scanning the ground in case something came scurrying in my direction. Nothing came scurrying in my direction, though. Instead, something rose up, beyond the freezer. I gasped so hard I choked on my gasp, and then I coughed. I was red-eyed, coughing my head off when I watched the thing rise up and up. It was as tall as I was now. It couldn't be a rodent if it were as large as me. Then it rose higher and higher, and I realized it was still standing up. It was taller than any man I'd ever seen, and almost entirely black. It looked like the silhouette of a man, but it wasn't a man. It had the head of a dog or a wolf or something. Very tall ears, very bad breath. This thing was what was smelling like death all this time. I took a few steps back toward the cellar door, and that thing sort of barked. It was so loud it hurt my ear, and so did the echo and the echo of the echo in that hard-walled basement. As I raced up the stairs, the loud barking had alerted my father, and he was trying to run down the stairs as I was trying to run up. He screamed at me to get out of his way, but I screamed back that he needed to get out of my way. I eventually crawled under his legs as he shouted at me, using all the words he told me I wasn't allowed to use. I got out of the basement just as my father got far enough down the steps to see the dog-headed man was running directly toward him and the exit. While I was running away, I suddenly found myself overtaken by my father, who I had never seen looking so alarmed before. His eyes were so wide, it looked like he had lost his mind. Suddenly, both of us were overtaken by the Dogman, who ran up to the edge of the forest and turned back, facing toward us. We both made a sharp U-turn and ran back into the basement, closing the door behind us to keep that thing from following us back inside. We had a chain and a lock for that door, but my father's friend just hadn't used it. We chained the door up again, and that was the last time we ever had to deal with an animal that large in the basement ever again. None of us had any idea we had a werewolf-type creature walking around our neighborhood. We have never seen it again since, and my parents both still live there. When I visit in the summer, my father and I still make jokes about going down to the basement and asking the Dogman if we can borrow some of his ribs to barbecue. Dogman's Shack, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. When I was a kid, my friends and I used to gather to play in my backyard, and we often wandered off into the forest behind the yard. Our parents gradually allowed us to venture further and further from home until one day, when I think I was 16, we went deep enough into the woods to discover the strangest, tiniest little shack. It was built out of cheap wooden boards, and it looked like it had been put up quite a long time ago. From a distance, it only looked like it could hold one person at a time, so at first we thought it was an outhouse. What's that old outhouse doing here in the middle of nowhere? When we got closer, we could see it was about the size of a medium-sized closet, and all four of us could fit inside as long as one of us stood outside and leaned in. There was nothing on the inside of the shack except an old Arabian-looking rug that smelled horribly. It had gotten wet and dried so often, it smelled like dead everything by this point. We looked around and found absolutely nothing inside the shack, so we were about to leave. That's when I noticed the floor in the middle of the room had more bounce to it than the floor by the edges. It also sounded sort of weirdly hollow when I kicked at it. I told the others we should lift the rug up and look underneath, but nobody wanted to help me. I rolled my eyes at their laziness and grabbed a corner of the rug to pull up. All of these tiny white and gray bugs that had been under the rug raced out in all directions, including up my arms. I screamed and ran outside, trying to get the bugs off of me. Some of them ran inside my clothes. It was gross, and I itched all over. While I was dealing with the set of issues that this had introduced, one of my friends started shouting at us that there was a trap door under the rug. Now the others joined forces to lift the nasty old rug and throw it out of the shack. The trapdoor was unlocked, and it opened easily, revealing a ladder leading down into the darkness. We couldn't see the bottom of the ladder, but none of us hesitated in immediately climbing downward. This was, by far, the coolest thing we had ever found in that forest or anywhere else. This was the early days of cell phones, and either we didn't have flashlights on them or we forgot we did. One of the guys had a little flashlight on his keychain, and that provided all our illumination. At the bottom of the ladder, there was only one way to go, and that was a primitive tunnel that stretched out further than our light. We started down in that direction, excited but quiet. We were aware that a loud noise underground could lead to a cave-in. We had learned that from the TV. Plus, I can't speak for the others, but I had the weird vibe that someone or something might have at least once lived down there. If we didn't run into someone alive, we might run into their remains. I wanted to explore until the keychain light started to go out, then split out of there and maybe come back the next day with better flashlights. We actually wandered for a while, but there was never more than one way to go. It was all one long, winding, curving, turning tunnel. Sometimes it was level, sometimes it was steeply uphill, and sometimes we slid down faster than we wanted to. We finally reached a fork in the tunnels and had to decide whether to continue left or right. Our friend with the keychain flashlight argued for neither. "I have to hold this down to keep it on, and my finger is getting sore," he whined. "Besides, the battery is going to go any second, and we don't want to be stuck down here without a light." That second thought sent a shudder through me, and I was about to second the motion of us heading back when I heard a sound. It was a dog-like sound, but it sounded like an unfriendly dog. Or maybe it sounded like a feral dog. I looked down the tunnels, both the left and the right ones. In both tunnels, I could swear I was making out eye shine in the darkness. I could only see it with my peripheral vision, but it looked like 3 or 4 dogs or wolves or coyotes in the left tunnel, and at least as many in the right one. I could see them in my side vision, but when I would look directly, I could no longer see the eye shine. Without the growling, angry dog noises, I wouldn't really be sure that I was seeing what I thought I was seeing. I suggested strongly to the others that we should split. One of them started to disagree with me when I swear this thing jumped out of the shadows, landing a few feet from us. It was not a dog, or at least not a normal one. It was standing on its hind legs, and it was continuing to proceed in our direction. We ran and climbed over each other to get out of there. Even in the pitch black, there was only one way to go, and that was the way we went. I remember crying, thinking that we were all going to die. I remember thinking I'd never taste my mother's awful meatloaf again, and how my little brother would never annoy me again. All the things I used to be bothered by, now I wished I could trade this moment for any of those. I wept for boring Saturdays with no plans. I cried for the chicken pox. I even cried for my homework. While I was feeling sorry for myself, I was also running like a lunatic, and when I saw the light coming from the ladder and the entrance, my tears turned to happy ones. All of us made it out of the hole, but we looked like total wrecks. None of us had fallen less than twice down there, and we were filthy from head to toe. Our clothes were torn and our hair messed up, but we didn't care because we were alive, living on borrowed time. We had been foolish to go down there unprepared, and at that point I was so happy to breathe fresh air and to see the waning light of the day's sun. We all headed back to my house, and when my mother saw us emerge from the woods, we got quite a shouting at. She demanded to know what had just happened, and not having had time to create a mutually agreed upon fake version of the story to tell adults, we just spilled the beans. We told her every detail from start to finish. She looked pretty concerned and told us to go inside and wash up. Then she started making phone calls. After we were washed, she was still preoccupied on the phone and wouldn't explain to us who she was calling. That night, my younger brother woke me up and called me over to the bedroom window. I looked outside, and my mom was there, and my father was there too, and a number of the adults in the neighborhood. They were all acting weird and very serious, talking about something too quietly for us to hear upstairs. Then they went off into the forest in a group, shining flashlights ahead of them. The two of us tried to sit up, waiting for them to come home out of the forest, but we both fell asleep, and we woke up when the sun rose. I had a bad pain in my neck from the way I had fallen asleep in the chair, but I had never heard or seen anyone come out of the forest. I could smell breakfast coming up from downstairs, though, so I knew my mother was back and that my brother and I had better get ready for school. That afternoon, after school, my brother joined my friends for a trip to the Dogman shack. This time we each had a nice big flashlight with us, so we felt we were thoroughly prepared for our adventure. When we reached the shack, though, we found it burned to the ground, rug and trapdoor included. And now the ladder hole was entirely filled with rocks of all sizes, from boulders down to pebbles. It looked like it would take a year to excavate that hole and get back down. That must have been what the adults were doing in the forest the night prior. They must have been closing off this hole. That meant they knew about the shack, and they knew about the hole with the ladder in it. Probably they knew about the Dogman. What else did they know that they weren't telling us? To her dying day, my mother refused to tell us anything about that hole or the Dogman. She denied having gone into the forest that night. She denied knowing anything about a group of adults burning the shack down. She insisted she thought we made up the story of the shack to cover for having gotten ourselves so dirty. Even on her deathbed, when she knew she was going to die, she refused to admit that she knew about any of this. So, as scary as that Dogman was, and as terrifying as our near miss with death was, the fact that my mother refused to ever let loose with even one secret about that underground tunnel system seems like the most frightening part of this story of all. What could be down there that would be so much more terrifying than the Dogman which we had already seen? What was that tunnel system? Where did it lead? And what did it have to do with the parents of my old neighborhood? Now that my mother is gone, these are questions that I will never know the answers to. In fact, the only one with answers about that place is the Dogman.
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
The Hopping Dogman. I saw a Dogman in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, and I lived to tell the tale. My wife and I were both avid campers when we were dating. In fact, camping was one of our absolute favorite things to do. It allowed us a chance to be alone together. Once we got married, a lot of the thrill of that left, but the real reason we stopped camping was because of that Dogman we saw in the Pine Barrens. It made a point of letting us know that we were no longer on the top of the food chain, and we both found that unnerving enough that instead of camping, we now stay home and watch TV shows about the outdoors. Before you laugh at us, you should know that we were really traumatized by this monster encounter. Let me give you the details so you can put yourself in our place and see how you think you would have handled it. This time we decided to go to a campground for families. I don't remember why. Maybe we thought we would socialize with other couples there or something. We rented this cabin, which was weird for us. We chose one on the north side of the park, right facing the woods. Even though we were part of this middle-class family campground community, we were on the outskirts of it and we got to sit and stare at the woods from 15 feet away. That was close enough to real camping for us, and at first we were satisfied. Soon enough, though, the constant sound of kids playing and activities being announced over amplified speakers had us wishing we had just pulled off the road in a swamp someplace and set up a tent instead. So, one day we decided to wander into the forest adjoining the campground. We had been trying to figure out, using the sketchy Wi-Fi available in the camp, whether the forest was on private or public land. We wanted to know if we'd be shot for trespassing by some local landowner, or if we'd be shot for trespassing by a forest ranger. We really couldn't sort it out though, so we just decided to take a walk anyway. I'm sure we weren't the first couple to wander into the woods next to the camp, yet we were both very concerned we'd run into trouble from local people. There were no local people bothering us over turf issues that week, though. We shouldn't have worried about it. We perhaps should have been more concerned that we were about to cross over into the territory of the New Jersey Dogman. So we strolled hand in hand through the woods, and it was very romantic, very relaxing, for the first 20 minutes or so. Then, I noticed my wife kept looking behind us. Finally, I asked her quietly what was going on. She said someone was following us. That was not a good thing to hear, since I had been planning on taking the same path back to our cabin. In fact, these woods were pretty dense and I hadn't seen any other path the entire time we'd been walking. I turned and looked behind us but saw nothing. I trusted my wife's instincts enough, however, to not doubt her in the slightest. We had better start back now and hope that whoever it was would allow us to pass. We'd have a better chance of it while it was still light out, I reasoned, and my wife agreed. Off we went, uncertain of who or what we might be walking toward. We must have gotten almost half the way back with no incident when we heard something large in the bushes directly ahead of us. We both stopped and held our breath. My heart was beating out of my chest. I told my wife it had to be a man or a bear in those bushes, because nothing else is that tall in this forest. She reminded me that elk, moose, deer, their antlers can reach that high up. I heard a growling then, and I'm pretty sure deers don't growl. Suddenly, a hairy monster with a dog-like head leaped out of the bushes and screamed at us. We ran back, deeper and deeper into the woods, and we could see that thing chasing us, not by running, but by taking massive leaps, one after the other. I never saw it drop to all fours. In fact, its front arms were a little too short for it to have done that. It remained on its hind legs, leaping after us, missing us each time but getting closer and closer. Then suddenly we fell down a steep hill and landed hard right onto black tar pavement. It was a highway. If the Dogman had wanted to eat us at that moment, we would have been too beaten up and bruised to even put up a fight. He never came out on the road, though. Eventually, we were picked up by a ranger who drove us back to our cabin, then hung out for some coffee before splitting. He seemed to want to make sure that we were okay, but he also wanted to share his off-the-record stories of Dogman encounters of his own. He'd seen the creature on multiple occasions. It seems angry, it shouts a lot, and it runs very quickly by hopping on its hind legs. It has a head like a dog or a deer, but a chest and arms like a muscle man. He's entirely covered in orange or brown close-cropped fur, has tall, pointed ears, and incredibly long, strong claws that literally double the length of its fingers. The front paws look almost like hands, and some of the rangers think the monsters are intelligent. The official line is that they don't exist, but in reality, park rangers are constantly on guard for them, hoping to steer them clear from human settlements and camping areas. When we asked him how the rangers could keep the Dogmen away, he admitted they really don't know of a way to ward the creatures off. He said they lure them to uninhabited areas by leaving bait in the form of dead animals. The creatures aren't just hunters, they also scavenge, so a well-placed deer carcass or two can re-traffic an entire clan of the monsters and keep the public safe. In fact, that's what the ranger said he was in the area scouting around for, and why he interviewed us so openly and transparently. After all that, though, he asked us not to tell anything to any of the other campers, and to keep a lid on the story in general. He warned us that people who came forward with too much information that the government doesn't want out can run into streaks of bad luck. I asked if he was threatening us, and he laughed. "I'm not threatening you," he said. "I'm warning you, same as I'd warn my own family. This is something that the government says doesn't exist. If you say it does exist, they might just start to regard you as what they call an enemy operative. Trust me, you don't want any part of the US government thinking of you as an enemy operative." He gave us both friendly pats on the shoulder, and then he drove off. At the first light of sun, my wife and I drove back home. I think we had our fill of nature on that day, at least I know I did. These days, we're happy to stay inside human developments in towns and cities. As far as we're concerned, the forests and the woods can remain the domain of the Dogman. Dogman in the desert. I don't know if you've ever driven across Death Valley, but it's quite a drive. Every single time I've gone, something incredibly weird has happened. The strangest thing of all, though, was the time I saw a dog-headed man running in the desert, pacing my car for miles and miles and miles. It was literally 112 degrees when I left Las Vegas and began the drive across the desert. If you think I mean that figuratively, you are wrong. It can get even hotter than 112 degrees in Las Vegas, and you can look that up. This day was only 112 though, and my air conditioning brought it down to more like 97 or 100, so it was a hot afternoon. At that point in my drive, I was on Route 190 driving through Death Valley and heading toward the little town of Stovepipe Wells, where I was going to stop for food and to stock up on water, which both my car and I were nearly out of. I had been seeing, for over 20 minutes, a very strange thing. I saw a humanoid figure running at impossible speeds. It was off in the desert, and I could only make out its silhouette. It was a tall, athletic humanoid running faster than an Olympic athlete. It looked real. It did not look like an illusion. Nothing about it seemed fake or imaginary in any way, but my mind knew it couldn't be there, and it couldn't be real. So there was this discrepancy or disagreement between my intellectual mind and my senses themselves. What I saw had me wondering if the heat was causing me to hallucinate. There was a man running out in the desert, and he seemed to be pacing my car. At first I thought he had a hat or a helmet on, but I swear, in the brief glimpses I got of him, it really looked as though he had the head of a wolf or a dog. I felt as though these were not the sands and winds of the American Southwest. I felt as though this god form and I were racing along in the deserts of ancient Egypt. With no human constructions in my line of vision, it really could have been any time. It could have been every time. I could sense beneath the sand there were buried civilizations stretching back to before the dinosaurs. I could see them in my eyes when I looked at the sand, but I knew it could only exist in my imagination. A sign passed for Stovepipe Wells, bringing me back to reality. I looked out in the desert, and I could still see the racing upright Dogman, heading west at incredible speeds. As I pulled into town, he seemed to veer off to the north and east, disappearing in the distance. I got myself some food to make sure my blood sugar levels were okay. Then I stared long and hard into my eyes in the grimy public bathroom mirror. I looked normal, a bit overtired, but not crazy. Not dehydrated, no dilated pupils. I seemed fairly normal, so maybe what I saw had really been there. Maybe I really was paced on the highway through Death Valley by the Dogman. My house has a one-car garage that's technically attached but can only be entered through the large front door, the way the car gets in and out. So imagine my surprise one night when I opened the door to get in my car and was met with the sound of a dog growling. And then imagine how I felt when the dog suddenly stood up. Okay, let me go back to the beginning. We had just moved into the house that weekend, and we, my wife and I, both wanted pizza for dinner. I was elected to drive into town and pick it up, so I went outside to the aforementioned garage. I don't know how to explain it, but I sensed something was wrong right off the bat. Something warned me to be careful when I hit my remote and sent that door moving upward. But I had parked the car in that driveway just that morning, and I knew for a fact there was nothing to be scared of in that garage. Nothing had been in there when I was in there last, and there was no other entrance except the one I was about to open. So why was I so nervous to open it? And yet I stood there, feeling myself begin to sweat. Why? Eventually, my adult mind overruled whatever part of me was sensing danger, and I opened the garage door. I did not immediately go inside, but looked around first. That was the deal I had made with my inner child. If you let me open the garage door, I'll let you look around before we go in there. After looking around and seeing nothing out of the ordinary, I took a step into the garage. I didn't take a second step, because that first one was met with the aforementioned growling. It didn't sound like the growling of a Chihuahua or a Beagle Terrier. It didn't sound like the growling of a Doberman or even a Great Dane. It sounded like the growling of something even larger than any of those. And yet, I saw no animal anywhere. I kept going to take my second step, but each time I did, the growling would get more intense and fierce. Whatever this thing was, it could see me, but I couldn't see it. I looked up, I looked down. All I could see was this one room, some supplies left over from the previous owner, and my car. That was when I noticed the trunk of my car was doing a little dance. If you don't know what I mean, don't feel alone. I don't really know what I mean either. It's just that my trunk seemed to bob up and down and sideways a little bit too. At this point, I was wondering if I was inhaling paint fumes or something and hallucinating. First I heard growling, then my car moved. Would I hear my car growl next? I was about to go get my wife and figure out if I was losing my mind when I saw someone leaning on the front hood of my car. At first, I actually thought it was a shadow figure. It was that dark, but then I saw a glint in its eyes and made out the unmistakable silhouette of a very large dog with its front paws leaning on my car hood. How the hell did that thing get in our garage? Now, I have to say, the first thing I thought of when I saw this thing was the old stories about black dogs coming and terrifying or even killing people in the old days. I forget where I read that, but supposedly it was an actual thing. People used to be afraid of black dogs and view them as supernatural. My heart was racing and the blood was pumping so fast to my head that I could feel and hear it. I was panicked. I had always thought of myself as being open to the possibility of paranormal and supernatural occurrences, but now that I was actually confronted with something that seemed to fit into that category, I wanted to cry and run home to my mother. I guess no matter how much I claimed to be open-minded, I was still really a materialist. This big black dog growling at me was breaking my concept of reality apart. I knew that even if the dog never touched me, he had already changed my life permanently just by showing himself to me. Now, the adult part of my mind tried to take over once again at this point. I needed to let the dog out of the garage. Once it escaped, I could use my car. Then I'd have to figure out how the heck the animal got in there and prevent it from happening again. But the first and main priority was to get out of the dog's way before it ate me and let it go free. So I retreated to the house and watched the garage from the kitchen window. Once I saw it leave, I would know it was okay for me to go get pizza. Eventually, my wife wandered by and asked me why I hadn't left to get the pizza yet. I told her she'd better sit down for this one and told her everything I just told you. She was scoffing and saying it was impossible. I couldn't disagree with her, it really was impossible. It was also what happened, though. So she went about her business warning me that I had 10 minutes to leave or she was going to call for delivery and make me tip the guy. I kept watching the garage door. My stomach made weird noises. I was starting to think about calling for delivery myself. That's when I saw it. The dog. It came out of the garage cautiously, sneaking around the side of my car, still holding onto the sides of it and up on its hind leg. Then it did this thing that really surprised me. It let go of my car and stood up all on its own. It just stood there like a man and looked around as though this were a normal thing for a dog to do. I thought about going outside to scare it off, but it dawned on me that this guy, and it definitely was a guy, was taller than I was when it stood up like that. I banged on the window, hoping to cause it to run away, but instead the dog ran back into the garage, on its hind legs of course, and I couldn't see it anymore. So my wife came back and saw me still by the window, and she started treating me like a child. She absolutely didn't believe me when I told her about the dog. She took my hand and led me to the garage. I told her it wasn't safe, that this was where I heard the dog growl. She said she couldn't hear it. I listened. I couldn't hear it either. She told me I was being ridiculous and asked me for the car keys. I protested, but she interrupted and demanded the keys, so I gave them to her. She started to walk in toward the driver's seat and asked me if I wanted to come with. I ran in, looking for the dog, hoping I would see it before it did something I would regret. My wife got in the car and unlocked the passenger seat. Like Pavlov's dog, I got inside, but I was still looking around, panicked. My wife was laughing openly at me. She started the engine and something stood up that had been crouching in front of the car. It was the black dog, big as a bear. It stood as tall as it could, its massive arms in front of it, and it roared. My wife screamed and screamed. Then she also screamed. She stared too. Staring and screaming, that was her thing at that moment. I would have preferred she drove out of the garage instead, so I shifted the gear into reverse and pushed on her knee to try to get her to step on the gas pedal. She woke from her screaming reverie long enough to do as I suggested. She floored the gas and we drove out of that garage and clear across the street before she applied the brakes. We nearly ran backward into a tree. We only missed it by inches. But there was no time to relax as the upright walking black dog ran out of our garage and directly for us. My wife did some fancy maneuvering and managed to pull forward and to our left. The creature banged directly onto my door, and now it was my turn to scream like a lunatic. I screamed as my wife drove away and kept screaming for a while longer than I meant to. It was something that seemed almost out of my control for a while. So, that night, we stayed at the motel near the pizza place. We debated selling the house right away and going, but we had spent more than we could afford just to move there, and moving again didn't seem like an option. We decided to try to rough it out and learn to live with this upright walking dog in the neighborhood until we could afford to move. We'd make moving our top priority and get out in a few months. We only had to survive a few months of the Dogman. Or so we figured. Anyway, that was almost 8 years ago now. We never saw that creature again. We never found any way it could have gotten into our garage, and we never saw it again. It remains to this day the greatest unsolved mystery of my or my wife's life. We still live in that house, and we will probably go to our graves wondering how the heck Dogman got in our garage. Don't forget, you can support our channel by subscribing at peterbernard.com. Subscribing gets you secret preview videos and other surprises, so join up today. Plus, we've got our new Scary Stories NYC t-shirt, which everyone loves. We'll be right back with another scary Dogman story, but first, here's Patricia with an informative message about how you can submit your story for us to read. Patricia?
Do you have a scary story you want us to read on the show? Just call our voicemail hotline, 804-LIST-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. And now for something completely scary.
Dogman in the Cemetery, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. The other night, I was driving past this cemetery in our neighborhood. It has Civil War era graves from the 1800s and has a small, knee-high metal fence around it. It used to be in the middle of the forest, but now the service road leading from the highway to my gated community passes right by it. I find the graveyard to be both rustic and authentically charming in both a historical and a personal sense, and I always at least gaze at it when I pass. But, like I said, the other night I was driving by, and when I looked, I saw something I've never seen before. I saw figures in the cemetery. Sneaky figures, as in people sneaking around or lurking. They were hiding behind the taller gravestones, and I could clearly see a figure behind a tree. It looked like someone intended some kind of trouble for our little historic cemetery. I thought about driving the rest of the way into town and getting security to come out and deal with it, but I thought maybe I could scare them off myself. Some of us get foolishly overconfident when we're behind the wheel of a car. So I stopped driving, pulled back a little, and angled my car to point toward the graveyard. Then I put on the high beams and shouted out of my window, "Hey, you! You better get out of there!" I waited, and at first, nothing happened. I inhaled to shout a second time, and then I saw someone darting from behind one tree to behind another one. He moved in such a sneaky fashion. He looked strangely guilty. That's the word that oddly hung over the scene. These people felt guilty about something. At least that's what their body posture communicated in the brief moments when I caught their creepy silhouettes. Shining my high beams at them hadn't shown me anything more than I had seen before, so I switched back to my normal headlights and decided to just drive home and let security handle it. And of course, that's when my car engine decided to give out. Just like that, it conked out dead. I tried to start the car again and again. This was not where I wanted to get stuck. It was getting darker, and I had no idea what kind of trouble those guilty-looking people sneaking around the cemetery had planned. What if they were some kind of sick cultists? What if they were into human sacrifice? I made sure all my doors were locked and kept trying the engine when I saw the creepy shadow people begin to creep out of the shadows. Then I could see, even in the darkness, that they weren't human. Or at least they weren't entirely human. They walked like people, that's for sure. They walked on their hind legs, or I should say they creeped. They snuck. They tiptoed. They kept looking around as though not wanting to be seen by anyone else. They didn't seem to care anymore if I saw them. I wondered if I were ever going to leave this scene. Maybe this would be where I died. I felt a sense of relief when I realized I could just call security and have them come help me.
But my relief turned to panicked horror as I remembered I had left my cell phone home. I checked all my pockets anyway, but I was certain I didn't think I would need it on this trip since I was just mailing some bills in town. Now the sweat was dripping into my eyes and stinging. My hands were all clammy too. I was really in a bad place, and I knew it. I could see that all these dogs had stationed themselves all around my car. They were mostly hidden in shadows behind bushes, trees, and rock. Some of them stood brazenly in the open, though, and I could see that these were the equivalent in size to men over 6 feet tall. Sneaky, guilty-looking men over 6 feet tall, but still. I am not ashamed to admit that I prayed that night. I had nothing to lose, and I was beginning to think I would never make it to the morning. I prayed in a most sincere fashion, entirely forgetting all the pro-atheist arguments I had written on the internet over the years. I figured if there was no higher power, then it didn't matter, and if there was, I probably had a bit of catching up to do. So I prayed. I begged for a chance to survive this. I promised if I were allowed to escape this unharmed, I would devote my life to something more worthwhile. I had no idea what I was talking about. I just didn't want to die that night. So, as if to answer my prayer, a car drove up behind me, and the dogmen scattered like cockroaches. They weren't entirely gone, but they had gone back into their sneaky, creepy hiding spots. The car pulled up next to me, and I recognized it as my neighbor Sandy. She asked me if I needed a jump, but I just asked if she could drive me back to the gated community. I resolved to deal with the car once the sun had come up. I just wanted safety for tonight. Sandy agreed, and then I had to drum up the courage to actually unlock my car and get out, then walk all the way around her Buick and get in the passenger seat. I was absolutely terrified of getting out into what might be a very dangerous and painful situation. I sat there, trying to will myself to get out and unable to move. My eyes started crying. I myself was too panicked to cry. It was like my body was crying in fear, unable to move. I counted to 3, closed my eyes, then made a break for it. I ran into her car, threw myself in, slammed the door, locking it. I begged her to drive. She looked at me and I looked around and asked me if I was all right. I begged her once again to drive, and I said I'd explain it to her later. I never did. I never planned to either. And that's the story of the time I saw the guilty, sneaky dogmen that like to hang around really old cemeteries. I only drive past that place in the day now. If I ever have to drive past it at night again, I promise you I will speed past it. I would never intentionally stop at that graveyard. It feels like it's been claimed as the turf of the Dogman. If you subscribe to this channel, you'd already have heard this next story. Sasquatch and UFO interrupt camping, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. Dear Scary Stories, this story happened to me in the early 1990s when my girlfriend and I were on vacation in the Pacific Northwest. As you might guess just from the setting, this story does involve a Sasquatch or Bigfoot, but it's mainly a story about a UFO that kept buzzing us and bugging us all night this one night. Okay, so we had a Honda Accord and we put our camping gear in the back and drove out west, camping in various places along the way. Everything was normal and we had no trouble the entire trip, which had us in a kind of very innocent, blissed out state. That was about to change. We decided to camp out near Mount Shasta. The weather was warm and dry, which you can't always count on over there. We had begun talking about the trip back and places we wanted to see going back which we had missed on the way here. I noticed my girlfriend looking over my head at points and to the left of me at others. I wondered if there were a mosquito there and I swatted at the air. She said no, I'm looking at that weird plane in the sky. I turned around and there was a light off in the sky a little bigger than the stars. I think that's Venus, I told her, then flirted about how that star was named after her. She rejected my flirting and said Venus didn't move all around. I looked back, and although it seemed to be in the same place, the light seemed somehow larger or brighter. As we talked for a while, I began to notice our surroundings seemed to be getting better lit. Sunlight wasn't for another 7 hours at least. I looked up, and that light had gotten as big as the moon. My girlfriend was convinced it was coming for us, and we both put out our campfire, packed up, and got in the car, not sure where we were going to head to. We drove just to get away from it, just to get away from that light in the sky. It seemed to be following us, but it's really hard to tell that kind of thing with an object that high in the sky. It could be an optical illusion and not really following you at all. At least that's what I kept telling myself and her. After a long time, my girlfriend gasped and said it flew away. She said it just sped off in a second and was completely gone. I asked where it went, and she just said, away. We drove for a while and passed a sign for a camping area with public restrooms. I asked her if she wanted to set up camp there and hit the hay. She was pretty distracted but said okay. It was not to be, because I swear to you, as we pulled off the exit toward the camp, there was a huge, as in giant, dark man standing under a tree alongside the road. I didn't just slow the car down, I stopped it. It's a good thing there was no traffic behind us at that hour of night. I was looking right at something that was too tall to be a man. But it was shaped like a man, not a bear. Its arms were too long to be a bear's arms. If that wasn't a Bigfoot, then it had to be a statue of a Bigfoot. Could that be what it was? A statue or a cutout of a Bigfoot? It was hard to tell. It was so dark, and whatever the thing was stood absolutely still. I sat there with my girlfriend, car engine running, not moving. And then that statue took a step toward us. I turned that wheel to the left and I hit the gas. We rode up onto the grass alongside the exit ramp and made it back onto the highway and away from that giant hairy man. We just drove to the nearest motel so we could sleep with a roof over our heads. When I tell this story, people ask me about missing time, and to be honest, we never thought about that at the time. I mean, we were pretty tired the next day, but that was to be expected. I'm not sure if we got to the motel in a normal amount of time or not, since we were not traveling in an area which I was really very familiar with. I know if I did experience it, I would probably not want to remember it, so I would not want to be hypnotically regressed or anything like that. I do feel in my heart of hearts that the Sasquatch we saw had something to do with the light in the sky. We did not see them at the same time, but it was on the same night, and I've never seen anything weird like that ever since. As far as I know, my ex-girlfriend never saw Bigfoot or UFOs again after that either. So the two things seem as though they must have in some way been related. I almost wish the men in black had visited us afterward. I would probably have had more questions for them than they had for me. As it is, that was the most confusing and frightening night of my entire life. The Steps in the Forest, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. This is one of those stairs in the woods kinds of stories, but it's probably not as wild as most of them. The stairs aren't clean and out of place. They're old and weather-beaten. They aren't fancy. They're ordinary. They don't look like they belong in a grand mansion. They look like they were put in place for a utilitarian purpose. But that's where these stairs get weird. They don't really seem to lead to any place. Go up the stairs, and you're almost immediately met by impenetrable overgrown forest. And the hill they are built into seems easy enough to climb without the stairs in one step or two. I used to like to sit there when I wanted to be alone because it seemed like sort of a place of mystery to me. It almost felt like steps leading up to the Fairy King's invisible throne. I wondered, had there been a building there at one time? Or had there once been a path through the trees here that has become overgrown from lack of use? If so, where did it lead? I realized I could probably just go online and check satellite photography, but somehow I don't think that would take away any of the mystery of that place for me. So, one day I was walking to the spot because I wanted to find a solitary place to meditate for an hour, and I came across a small building. There were steps leading up to the small building. Were those my steps? They sure looked like them, but they were in better condition and varnished or painted with some kind of finish. They looked brand new. The small building was painted white with red trimmings. The white parts shone in the sun and nearly blinded me. There was a window with a sign over it reading information. The window had a shade drawn on the inside. I guess it was an information booth, but it was closed. Information is exactly what I felt I needed at that moment. Clearly, I had gotten turned around. I thought I was heading to my stairs, but I headed to these stairs instead. Turning around, I retraced my steps back, and halfway there, I was certain I hadn't been lost. Someone must have put up that information booth in the last couple of days since I had last visited. Those were my steps. Laughing at my confusion, I turned back around to check out the new information booth and see if I could find out what info they were dispensing there. Well, now I was thoroughly befuddled, as when I returned to the spot, it was back to looking like it had always looked before. No information booth. No fancy shiny varnish on the steps. I was as confused as I'd ever been, and more than a little frightened. I wasn't thinking I was time traveling or anything. I was doubting my sanity. I was wondering if I was losing control of my senses, and that is a frightening thing to be worried about. I sat down on the steps and tried to meditate, but the experience had shaken me up too much, so I went home after a while. After taking a nap, I woke up with the idea of contacting a local historian that I know and asking her if she knew about that location and what used to be there. I had gotten the notion in my head that I had seen a ghost building, something out of the past. If that were true, I was still dying to know what kind of information the booth used to dispense. So I got her on the phone, and she told me that her family had in fact built that little staircase. It was not the steps leading up to an information booth, however. Her brothers had built the staircase because it led to a path in the woods leading to their family home. It was to help their mother make the trip to the store after she had entered her later middle years and allow her a little bit more independence. There had never been an information booth or any building of any sort on that platform above the stairs, but the path through the woods had once been clear-cut and easy to walk. I thanked her for the information, and I guess it's irrefutable, so now I know for a fact that I did not see a ghost building that day. I did not see something out of the past. So, what did I see? The stone that wasn't a stone, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. Dear Scary Stories, have you ever heard a Dogman story that also involved the Men in Black? Well, that's what happened to me, and I'm going to tell you about it. Yes, I saw a Dogman. There's not much more to say about it than that. I was driving to work in the early morning on the highway, and there was a partition between the two sides of opposing traffic. There was this creature there on the grass in the middle of the highway. It had long, tall ears on top like a jackal. I at first thought it was a kangaroo, but it was too dark to be a kangaroo. The sun was already high enough in the sky that I could see with some detail. It was eating something, and it wasn't eating a carrot. It was definitely a carnivorous predator or scavenger. I felt a sense of revulsion and abhorrence that I never felt for any living creature before. It felt noxious and wrong. It felt like it shouldn't be there, and in fact, it shouldn't be anywhere. This was something sickening that shouldn't even exist. And yet there it was, feasting. After driving past it, I couldn't bear the idea of working that day any longer. I phoned my boss and I told him I had to rush home. I was sick suddenly while driving to work. He was understanding about it, probably because he could hear my voice. He knew I wasn't kidding. I got off the next exit and took a different route home. When I got there, I was surprised to find my wife and daughter had left for school already. They usually were there for another half hour. I kicked off my shoes and headed straight for my bedroom. I had a Dogman hangover and sleep seemed to be the only cure. And so, as you might expect, the doorbell rang. When I went to answer it, I was very weirded out to see it was 3 guys in black suits. It was full daylight, but they still seemed intimidating. All 3 of them wore dark, reflecting sunglasses. One of them was larger than the other 2, and he kept looking all around constantly. The other 2 were staring directly at me through the glass. I really didn't want to open the door, but I did. They explained they were from the Air Force and showed me some kind of ID. Might have been from the back of a cereal box for all I know. Idiotically, I let them in. The third one stayed where he was and kept looking left, right, up, down. When the 2 men walked into my house, they stopped in unison and stared at my feet, which I now realized were bare since I had taken my shoes off when I came in. The 2 of them looked at each other and just stood there staring at each other for a while. Then, again, in unison, they both kicked their shoes off and we all walked into my home together barefoot. We sat at my dining room table and they spoke to me in a most reassuring fashion. They told me that they knew what I had seen and they were very sorry for what had happened. They asked me politely if I would choose the patriotic choice and not tell anyone about the encounter. I told them that was fine by me since nobody would believe me anyway. That seemed to foul up their internal computers or something because they both stared at each other again. It was like they were communicating silently. Then at once they both insisted that people would believe me, hence it would be more patriotic for me to never mention the sighting at all. I laughed, and the one of them seemed to get really set off by that. He stood and insisted strongly that none of this was a laughing matter and that I was behaving in a most suspicious and unpatriotic manner. I found myself wanting him to stop being so angry, so I told him most seriously that I would keep the Dogman story secret to myself in the name of patriotism. They looked at me, then at each other for an even longer time than before. Finally, they stood and left my house without saying another word. I followed them out and saw them get into a black limousine and drive away. The limo had no license plate, at least not in the back. I couldn't see the front from my angle. I am 100% certain that whoever those 3 guys were, they were not from the US government, but I don't have a single guess as to where they were from. So you would think that was the end of the story, except this spring I got all ambitious with gardening. I guess I'm getting older. I now find gardening as fascinating as I once found single-shooter video games. So anyway, I decided to cut the hedges away from one of the sides of our house, and I found the strangest thing. It was this rock, like a stone, except it's not a stone, it's artificial. I tried to dig it up, but it seems to be attached to a metal pole or cable that goes more than 2 feet deep. I know because that's the deepest I've dug around it so far. Now I'm a little afraid to even go near it. I might electrocute myself or something. It's clearly a device, and the only ones who could have put it there would be those men in black. There are stories of these space aliens or interdimensional people using devices that make humans sick through radiation. Maybe I should get a Geiger counter and check the levels around that thing? I'm thinking that I should call in an expert, but who is an expert on fake rocks permanently attached to the side of your house? The U.S. Intelligence Service doesn't usually make house calls. Well, okay, I guess they do, but not when you want them to. At any rate, I'm looking to sell this place and get out of here. I might move to a more populated location. At least then, I won't be the only one getting spied on. I have to say, the artificial stone freaks me out even more than the initial visit of the 3 men. And you know what else I don't understand? What the heck any of this has to do with the Dogman? The voice from under the stairs, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. Dear Scary Stories, when I was a kid, we would sometimes stay at my Aunt Esther's house in the suburbs to get away from city life during the summer. The first night, my parents would sleep over, and then they would leave after breakfast, and we'd play there for a week until they came back the next weekend to pick us up. I remember the first night we were ever there. We were getting ready for bed, and I was ready first, so I was downstairs hanging with the adults while everyone else brushed their teeth or whatever it was. The adult conversation was boring me, but I could hear another conversation taking place under the staircase leading up to the bedrooms on the second floor. I went and put my ear on the wall, and then I was certain there were 2 or 3 men having a conversation about something. I felt like I could almost make out what they were saying, but never quite. Eventually, my father noticed my ear pressed to the wall and asked me what I was doing. I said to him I could hear talking in the wall, and he told me it was the people who lived downstairs. Oh, well, that explained it. I didn't know my aunt had tenants downstairs. Mystery solved. I went to bed. The next day, I was talking with my aunt after breakfast, and I mentioned the people who lived downstairs. She seemed confused and asked me if I meant back at home where I lived with my parents. I said, no, the people who live downstairs here, the people who I could hear talking under the stairs last night. She gave me quite a strange look, then took me by the hand and led me to the basement door. Opening the door, she turned the light on by pulling a string, and I saw an old wooden staircase that seemed hand-built and unsteady. It led down to a basement with a dirt floor. There was one tiny ground-level window letting in a little bit of light through its dirt-covered glass panes. I could practically hear all the spiders there must have been down there. I shuddered and backed away from the door. Nobody lives downstairs here, my aunt informed me, chuckling. It wasn't until the next day that my aunt showed me that there is in fact a room under the staircase, and the entrance to it is in the back of the pantry in the back of the kitchen. She just had some old boxes stacked up in there and wasn't using the room for anything else. We went inside, and she theorized that maybe my brother and sister were getting ready for bed upstairs and were talking to each other, and it reverberated through this room, and that was what I heard. I had to admit it was very echoey in that tiny space, so I figured the mystery was solved until the Friday before my parents were due to come back. Everyone except me went into town to get groceries. I stayed home because I was watching a scary old Vincent Price movie on TV and I wanted to see how it ended. It turned out I wouldn't find out anyway because a flash thunderstorm hit and the electricity on the entire block got knocked out. My family was stuck in town in the lightning storm, having lunch and waiting for it to let up a bit so they could come home. They had no idea I was in a blackout. I felt panicky at first, but then I realized everyone would be home in an hour or 2 max, and I should probably just go find some candles and chill, because it was probably going to just be a matter of waiting. That relaxed me, and I was placing candles around to light the main room when I could have sworn I heard someone talking. I was excited my family was home and ran to the front door, but there was nobody there. From the front door, I could hear that the talking was coming from inside. It was coming from the room under the staircase. I tiptoed over to the wall and put my ear to it. For certain, it was men talking once again. And once again, I couldn't make out what they were saying. The difference was that this time, I knew how to get inside that room. I went to the kitchen, and I grabbed a flashlight and something or other to use as a weapon. Then, without any delay or ceremony, I kicked open the pantry door and I charged on through the second door into the room under the stairs, in which I found just those boxes that my aunt had stacked there. Nobody talking. I listened and I couldn't hear it anymore. I wish I could tell you what was making the sound, but that was the last time I ever heard it. I guess I can be certain it wasn't made by my brother and sister, but that's about all I can say with certainty. Nobody else but me ever noticed this phenomenon, so I guess it might be chalked up to my imagination when I was a kid. Except to me personally, that explanation does not hold water. I know what I heard. I just don't know what was making it happen. There has to be some real, scientific explanation of what happened to me and what I heard. I've never heard strange sounds again since, so it has to have been something real. Caveman in the Pantry, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. I have a story that's strange and very short. When I was young, maybe 8 or 9, my mother dropped me off at our former neighbor's house when she went shopping in our old neighborhood. See, we used to live next door to this lady, so we were familiar with her. Whenever I would get to stay at her place, she would let me watch whatever I wanted on television, which my mother never did. And she would let me help her bake some sweet treat that we'd share before I left. Going into her pantry to choose what thing to bake was always one of my favorite things to do when I was a kid. Until, that is, one day when she pulled the curtain back in the doorway to her pantry, and there, in real life, stood what I can only describe as a caveman. It looked exactly like a caveman from a Hollywood movie. It had wild, unkempt hair, a low brow ridge, a crazy beard, and I think it was even wearing some kind of an animal skin around its bottom. I remember it being filthy, covered all over in dirt. It screamed, and we screamed back, and it screamed louder, and we ran. I remember running into a closet and hiding, crying until our neighbor found me later. The caveman broke a few things, and there was a bit of a mess, but he made it out the back door of the house and he was gone now. We never got to bake anything that day, and we never understood how the heck a prehistoric caveman came to be standing peacefully in her pantry as though he was just waiting for us to pull the curtain back. I mean, he was making no noise before we went in there. There was no other way in there except through the kitchen, so why didn't we see him walk in there? And how could he have even gotten into the house, since all the windows and doors were closed and locked? It's a mystery that she and I never solved, and in fact, she asked me not to speak about it to the other adults. She didn't have to explain why, and I honored her request. It's still the strangest thing that ever happened to me. To this day, every time a curtain gets drawn back, my heart skips a beat, wondering what's going to jump out from behind there. My ghost was in love with me. As told to and read by Peter Bernard. The title of this story might make it sound like a 1960s sitcom, but having a paranormal or supernatural entity attach itself to you and think it's in love with you can be a very unpleasant and frightening experience. When I was a teenager, my parents moved out of the city into the country, which was traumatic enough for me at that age. But the house they chose to move into had a female ghost who became very possessive of me very quickly. We called her Mary, although my later research turned up a death certificate for a girl named Nellie who died in this house of pneumonia when she was 17. If the entity that haunted me was actually the spirit of a dead girl, it seems most likely to have been Nellie. But I don't know if that's what this spirit was, and I don't want to make any presumptions. I'd rather try to stick with the facts, even though they don't really lead us to much of anywhere in this case. So, when I would bring girlfriends home, or even friends who were girls that I was not dating, strange things would begin to happen. Their personal belongings would go missing and turn up later in the car or in the refrigerator freezer. One time, one of my girlfriends seemed to trip on the staircase, and she said she felt someone push her on her shoulder. If she hadn't been able to grab the banister, she might have fallen and really hurt herself. One time, I was dating a girl who fancied herself a psychic. She seemed most certain that this was a female spirit who felt bonded to me. One time she slept over, and in the morning she was in the bathroom and I heard her scream. Racing in, I discovered her seeming very traumatized, looking all around her. She said that she looked in the mirror and saw a cadaver standing behind her, the body of a dead girl reflected in the mirror. She and I didn't see each other too much longer after that. I wish I had a big climactic ending for this story, but I went away to college, and during that time, my family moved to a house in an entirely different state. We haven't heard from the jealous ghost girl since, although a lot of my stuff has been put in storage, and my friends here at school are warning me that she might be attached to some of my old belongings. My inclination at this point is to leave most of them in storage permanently, because life is a lot more fun when you don't have a jealous, invisible girl messing everything up for you. I saw a snake with arms, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. Dear Scary Stories, I was camping in Indian Springs Campground in Texas, and I was wandering through the trees next to there. I'm not really clear if that's their property or what, but there's a forest right near there. So I was wandering through the woods, and I saw a bird on the ground messing with a bug or a worm or something in the dirt. I didn't want to disturb the scene, and I wanted to get to watch a minute of that bird's life, so I ducked behind a tree and I remained as silent as I could, watching with great interest as the bird went about its business. All at once, and I'm not sure if the bird was more shocked by this or me, but all at once a snake hurled itself from a tree branch overhead and tried to grab the bird with its arms. This snake had arms, like little green clawed human arms essentially. I don't know if they had 5 fingers, it might have been 3, but they were hand-like claws at the end of thin arms. I shouted out in surprise as I saw the snake pouncing. I think my shout frightened the bird and it took off flying just before the snake could grab it, and all it ended up with in its claws were some feathers it had grabbed from the tail. The closest I can compare the snake to is, imagine a rough green snake that grew to like 4 or 5 feet long and had clawed arms in front. Or maybe imagine a dinosaur on top but a snake on the bottom. That was what I saw. I beat it out of there before the snake came after me, and I never went back in those woods again. The ghost led us to a hidden passageway, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. My wife and I moved to an old house, a mansion really, by the coast up in Maine. For the most part, it had been refurbished and modernized, and we were in no way roughing it there. This was about 10 years ago. We had only been married 2 years, we didn't have any children yet, and we were both obsessed with our own separate careers, which had allowed us to purchase a big house before either of us were 30 years old. You get the picture, 2 self-absorbed, career-minded yuppies, unappreciative and even unaware of all the history surrounding them. So one night, my wife and I were taking some time off and actually paying attention to each other. We got frisky and my wife slapped me on the butt, squealed, and ran out of the room. I knew that meant she wanted me to chase her and tickle her. That's her thing. When she's in a playful mood, she loves to be chased and tickled. So you can imagine my surprise when I raced out of the room and ran straight into her back as she was no longer running. She was standing still in the hallway, blocking my path. Curious, I glanced over her shoulder to see what she was looking at. There was a man. There was a man in our second-story hallway. "Hey!" I shouted angrily. "Who the bleep are you?" I demanded to know, except I didn't say bleep, as you can imagine. The man ignored me. I now considered trying to subdue him, and I sized him up. He was facing away from us, but I could see he was my height and broad-shouldered. He was wearing a long black coat, black pants, and black shoes. He was a Caucasian man with dark hair, not young, not old. Older looking than I was at the time, but he looked like he might be able to take me in a fight. He was walking away from us slowly toward the wall at the end of the hallway. I shouted again, demanding to know who he was and what he was doing there. He didn't seem to hear me, and he turned to his right, and he walked right into the wall. My wife screamed in complete panic, and I have to admit I felt like doing the same. My legs felt like rubber bands from the shock of what I had just seen, yet somehow I propelled myself to the spot where he had disappeared and felt the wall. It sure felt solid. I didn't see any openings there. You have to understand, this did not look like a ghost. It looked like a guy in a long black overcoat in our hallway. And then he just walked through the wall, which I was now touching with my fingers, trying to see if I could slip through it somehow as well. My wife came over and started knocking on the wall. It sounded hollow in the area he had walked through, as though there were an empty space behind it. We knocked other places and did not get that hollow sound. There had to be an opening in the wall somehow. I pushed and tugged in various spots until we both noticed that part of the wall seemed to be separating slightly from the other part. This must have been a sliding door at one time, we could tell. It was sealed up now. We'd have to tear the wallpaper off to open it, but there was definitely a sliding door at this spot in the past. That was when my wife and I first realized that what we saw could very well have been some sort of shadow or reflection from the past. It seemed like a recording of an event because whoever it was didn't seem to hear anything I was shouting at it. As soon as business hours started the next day, we were on the phone with the real estate lady who had sold us the place, asking more details about the history of the mansion. She seemed surprised that we were interested. She said she tried to tell us these things during our first tour of the house, but we just ignored her and kept staring at our phones. She asked me why we were interested now. I didn't want to tell her because I didn't think I believed in ghosts back then, and I was very concerned at that age with being taken seriously. So she asked me outright, "Did you see it?" "Did I see what?" "Did you see the ghost?" she asked. I dropped all pretenses and told her yes, and asked her why she hadn't warned us we were moving into a haunted house. She laughed and laughed, enjoying my misery. Then she told us that the sealed-off secret passageway used to lead to underground tunnels and storage rooms, then onto the beach, where cargo used to be unloaded from ships and loaded into the house. No great mystery, really, just tunnels and rooms that no longer served any purpose. She said that the old master used to keep the hallway door slid open most of the time and would walk to and from the storage rooms himself to personally choose his wine and vegetables. That was all we had seen. It was nothing to be afraid of, she assured me. As long as the master has access to his wine, she said, he won't come and haunt you in your bedroom at night. Then she cackled heartily at our expense and hung up on me. My wife said she heard the old man walking around upstairs a couple of times when I wasn't home, but neither of us have ever seen him again. It became a funny story to tell guests who would visit. I guess he just showed himself to us that first time to say hello or to let us be aware of his continued presence in the home. Then he never felt the need to manifest in front of us again. We stayed there around 3 more years, and although it was one of the most lovely homes I could ever imagine staying in, I have to say I felt a huge sense of relief, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders when we finally got to move. The entire time I was there, I felt like something was tapping into my energy, and I was never at full power. I don't think the ghost or whatever it was intended to do harm or evil. I think it just sucked up the energy of my wife and me so that it could continue to exist. Although I don't think it meant any harm, I'm glad to be away from the ghost of the secret passageway. Hey, I gave you guys a story called Dogman of Dogtown the other day, and I read it when I was on the bus, and the sound was really terrible. I think it's a good story. I'd like to read it again for you guys and do a better version of it. So here it is, Dogtown Dogman, as told to and read by Peter Bernard. Dogtown, Massachusetts, located in the middle of the woods, has a history of strangeness that led up to its becoming a ghost town, and possibly an even weirder history since. It was first settled in 1693 because it was hidden away in the forest and inland where pirates never noticed it. In the late 1700s, at its peak, around 100 families hid out in Dogtown. There are several stories as to how it got its name. One is that there were lots of stray dogs in the area roaming free. A different story has it that it was named after the wolves who lived in that forest. Another was that after everybody else had left the town, the few witches who remained there hired dogs to guard them. In some versions of the story, the dogs that the witches employed were werewolves. According to a late folklorist named Roger Cahill, the Agawam Indians claimed that their ancestors who came from the Dogtown area were in fact canine-headed humans. He also claimed that a local form of the wolfbane plant which grows in the area would change any person's head into that of a dog. The town was abandoned before the 20th century when Roger Babson, the founder of Babson College, decided to employ local out-of-work stonecutters to carve weird messages like "Be clean," "Keep out of debt," and "Help Mother" on large boulders all over the site, making a visit to the location even more surreal. I read a quote from Babson online saying that doing the work brought him great pleasure, but that his own family felt he was defacing the stones and embarrassing all of them. I have to admit the Babson boulders, as they are now called, were the main reason I wanted to visit the area and why I decided to camp out in Dogtown, which is now a park. There are stories of large wolves and supposed werewolves in the area, and I did know that before my trip. For instance, on March 17, 1984, someone reported seeing a huge wolf in the area. 4 days later, the carcass of a deer was found, killed but not eaten. That same night, other people reported seeing a monstrously large gray animal run into the woods. Rumors swirled that Dogtown had its own immense, murderous werewolf. I could see no stories online of any werewolf activity in the area since then, so I figured that was all hogwash. My trip happened in 2008, long after the sightings of the large gray predator. I just wanted to see the remains of the cellars of the old Dogtown buildings, read as many of the Babson boulders as I could with my own eyes, and generally enjoy the place as much as I could for one day and one night, then boogie on out of there. I figured it would be like any of the dozens of other times I had gone camping. I was very wrong about that. First of all, the place is extremely disorienting. I remember finding a boulder that read, quote, "If work stops, values decay," unquote, and scratching my head contemplating that one for a while. Then I wandered in what I thought was a straight line for about 10 or 15 minutes, and somehow I found myself right back at the work stop value decay boulder. What? How had that happened? Since then, I've read David Paulides' books, and he mentions boulder fields as being a common place for his mysterious disappearances to happen. I think if I had known that at the time, I might not have chosen to camp so close to those giant weird things. I might have been going a little bonkers from the high strangeness vibe that the area emits, but I felt like the Babson boulders each exuded their own personality. Some of them indeed seemed to feel as though they had been defaced. Others felt that the mottos mirrored their own sentiments and they bore them proudly. I guess this was all caused by my imagination, the heat, and the surreal location. 2 more times that day I got lost and walked in circles while thinking I was going straight. I found that I needed to concentrate far more than usual just to travel from one location to the other. The entire day felt different. It might be the Oz effect that some researchers into the paranormal and UFOs talk about. The feeling like somehow you're not in Kansas anymore. Or Massachusetts in my case. So I set up camp and got ready to settle in for the night, not really satisfied with my trip and still unnerved by how many times I had gotten turned around in that one day. I was trying to remember the last time something like that had happened to me, and to be honest, it had never happened that bad. I wondered if I were okay. Was I dehydrated? Was my mind okay? My original plan had been to travel to a different location to camp the second night, but now my plan was to head home first thing in the morning and spend the day resting. If I didn't feel normal by Monday, I was already wondering what kind of doctor I should be going to see. So I was a bit stressed out as I fell asleep in my tent that night. I woke up to the sound of something, sort of growling or snarling outside my tent. It sounded like a dog, but an agitated one. I then heard it howl, and I could tell it was a large one as well, and it was right outside my tent. In those days, I never used to bring a firearm with me when I went camping. That night is the reason I now do. I was never so frightened in my life. I tried to be as still as I could because now I could hear the huge dog sniffing my tent. I never sweat so much in my life before or since. I was convinced I was going to get ripped up by that thing. I was shaking all over and completely on edge. The big dog barked. I screamed. He scared me too much. I couldn't deal anymore. He kept barking, and I kept screaming. And then the thing tore my entire tent apart in a savage flurry of claws and teeth. He just ripped the top away, and he was looking at me, and I could get a clear look at him, from his knees to his head, because this was not a dog. This was a hairy man with the head of a dog. A wolf-like dog. Its arms were sort of halfway between wolf arms and human arms. Its legs appeared to be sort of the same. But it was a bipedal creature like a human, even though it looked mostly like a wolf, if that makes any sense. If it had the head of a dog, I got inspired with the idea that it might have the brain of a dog as well. I grabbed my water bottle and wham, I smacked that huge upright dog on the nose hard with it. He yelped and took a few steps back, whimpering. I stood up quickly. "Bad dog!" I shouted, making myself as big as I could and sounding as deep as I could make my voice sound. Still, as big as I tried to be, I had to tilt my neck way back to look up at this monster. I took a quick step forward while making some kind of angry caveman sound. The dog retreated to the wood line, then turned around and watched me intently. He still hadn't made up his mind about me, apparently. I got my stuff packed in record time while trying to look casual about the whole thing, and I beat it back to my car. The thing watched me pack and leave but did not follow. Since then, I've researched all I could about that place, and although giant wolves are a common thing for people to see over there, I think I might possibly be the first to ever report an upright walking canid in Dogtown. So, if you're visiting Dogtown Common, don't just watch your step around the ancient basement dugouts from the old colonial houses. Also watch your step at night around the Dogman. Pakwaji gang attack. Back 10 years ago when I was in high school, I had my first car, an antique Nash Rambler I had restored from junk parts. Since I had taken the initiative to build it myself, my parents allowed me to pretty much go anywhere I wanted to, and I enjoyed a lot more freedom than most other kids my age. One night just past dusk, I was driving home from Vienna, Maryland to Mardella Springs on Ocean Gateway or US 50 when my car stalled just after I got over Nanticoke River. I managed to pull off the side of the road before it completely conked out, and I got out to walk the rest of the way home, which was probably a 45-minute or an hour-long walk. It was looking like rain though, so I was hoping I could make it home a little faster than I might have normally. I was thinking about my car as I walked. I was pretty sure I knew what broke, but I also knew it would be a few weeks before I could afford to buy it. I might get lucky at the junkyard. I decided to go to the junkyard first thing in the morning, and maybe I could have my car running again by the afternoon or evening. I was lost in thought, thinking of ways to fix my car without spending too much money, when I felt this deep, strange feeling. It was like a serious mood shift took over the entire area. Do you know that feeling when you're a kid and you're happy, then suddenly an angry parent comes home? All of a sudden nobody is allowed to be happy anymore? This was like that. A sudden, scary shift of mood. But there was nobody around except me as far as I could see. I just kept walking, sometimes trotting. Now I saw a lightning bolt off in the distance. I counted after seeing the bolt to guess at how far away it was. I counted all the way up to 9 before hearing the thunder rolling in. Did that mean it was 9 miles away? I still had most of the walk to go. Maybe it was the coming rain making me feel so strange. I quickened up my pace and started jogging. I came to this dirt road along the highway. Could swear I heard people talking from in there. I don't know why I cared. For some reason I slowed down and looked in, wanting to see who was talking. But why did I do that? I should have run faster, not slowed down. But I did slow down. And when figures began to emerge from the darkness and come out at me, I slowed to a complete stop and just looked at them. They were tiny people, like the Ibu Gogo, like the hobbits. They were hairy little men, wearing little loincloths and metal necklaces that looked like they were made out of people's lost jewelry and bits of soda cans cut in geometric shapes. I was not frightened of them at all. I remember thinking they looked like chipmunk people. I smiled and bent over, then started talking to them the way you talk to your pet cat. One of them threw dirt in my eyes, blinding me and causing a lot of pain. I have no idea what caused all the pain which ensued, since I was temporarily unable to see anything. I don't remember what happened next, but I woke up with a bad headache and my eyes caked shut with mud. When I was able to clear my eyes well enough to see, I saw that it was the early morning. I got up and began staggering home. I was picked up soon after by my mother, who had been driving around looking for me for hours. I was only able to tell her that I had been beaten up, and she drove me to the hospital. I had a concussion which messed me up for about half a year before I was really back to normal. I forgot to mention, when I woke up, my gold watch and silver ring were gone. Everything else was intact, including my cash, phone, and debit card. But then again, what use would a gang of feral hobbits have with those things? I looked on the internet to find out what these creatures might be, and I found out there are legends of creatures like this existing in this general area, or at least in the same state. The name for them is Pakwaji. I have only read a few articles online, but it seems they are known for tricking humans into wandering into the woods where the Pakwaji can have at them. What I encountered seems in a way even more frightening. I saw a gang of Pakwaji. They were organized. Their actions were not random. One of them disabled me, others attacked me, others robbed me. What I would say to you, if you live in Delaware, is this. Don't go walking alone at night along old country highways and roads. If my car broke down again and I was in that same situation, I would lock myself inside the car, get on my phone, and call for help. Then, I would remain locked inside my vehicle until help arrived. The only other bit of advice I would give is to have your camera ready in case you happen to see a strange little furry man emerge from the forest wearing my gold watch. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of you who send us stories about your encounters with cryptids or the unexplainable, and to thank you for your patience with my adaptations of your life events. Sometimes when I'm going through stories, I see connections between things that people report in different locations. They'll use different words to describe what they're seeing, but it can often sound an awful lot like the same cryptid reported from a different state. These next stories are all from different listeners and all from different locations within the United States. They all describe different monsters or cryptids, yet there are such strange overlaps between the sightings that I can't help but wonder if the creatures are somehow connected to each other in some strange way. I'll tell you each of the stories, and you can see if you notice the same things I noticed, about how similar all four stories are, and yet how different they are as well. The Devil in the Snow. This was a story my grandmother used to tell as a true story from her childhood. It wasn't a bedtime story or a campfire story. It was just a story of an event from when she was young. She would tell the story of her brother breaking his leg. She would tell the story of the time her father was elected sheriff but resigned 2 weeks later. And she would tell the story of the Devil in the Snow. All three stories were presented as history, not fable. So, my grandmother and her family lived in a house on a small farm in the middle of the country in Maryland. One winter morning, she woke up to find snow covering everything outside. There were drifts right up to the bottom of her bedroom window, but there were other areas in which the snow was only around a foot deep. Grandma said she hurried to put her snow boots on while her sister had already gone out to start taking care of the animals. Then her sister ran back into the house screaming something about the devil walking around the house. Everyone, including Grandma, went outside and demanded the sister point out what she was talking about. Sure enough, there were footprints in the snow in the shape of a cloven-hooved beast, but they were clearly left by a bipedal creature. And the most incredible thing of all about the footprints is that they were all emitting steam. It was as though the footprints were hot, and the snow was melting and forming steam above each one. Grandma says she stomped around, leaving the deepest footprints she could in the snow, yet none of them started smoking like the devil's footprints. The family followed the prints to see where they would lead, but they simply ran in a circle around their house and nowhere else. They didn't seem to have a beginning, and they didn't seem to have an ending point either. They just ran in a continuous circle around the farmhouse. The next day, the snow had started to melt, but the devil's footprints were still there, and they were still smoking. Neighbors came from miles around to see them, and a priest came from 2 towns over to bless the place, pouring small amounts of holy water into each footprint. By the following morning, the snow had all melted, and the prints were gone. Some people credited the holy water, others credited the warmer weather, but no matter how or why they were gone, The fact is that they were. Nobody in the family ever found out why the devil danced around their house that night in the snow, or why he never returned. But be careful if you're out in nature during the last big snowstorm of every season. That's the time the devil likes to come out. And that's the time he likes to dance. Goatman in the snow. Back in 1972, I got to stay with my Uncle Ned at his farm for an entire Christmas vacation. It was really a house with a large backyard and some animals, but he called it a farm. It was in the woods near California, Maryland, which is south of Baltimore and Washington, D.C. There's a state park right there named St. Mary's that his property used to be right on the border of. So Uncle Ned lived in a land between civilization and nature, right on the border of both. One night, it snowed really hard. It was a few days after Christmas, but to me it was the closest thing to a real Christmas snow that I'd ever seen. I grew up in a neighborhood of apartment buildings, and getting to be here watching trees and dirt get covered with snow was the kind of Christmas TV had always promised me. I was really loving it, staring out the window and watching the snow fall in the darkness. It was sticking before the sun even went down, so that by 9 or 10 that night, it was already probably 4 or 5 inches deep. That's when I thought I saw eyes shine from the patch of trees off in the distance. I pointed it out to my uncle. It had to be 8 feet off the ground. What is 8 feet tall and gives off that oddly colored eye shine? Kind of a green, but not exactly a green? Uncle Ned said it was probably an owl or some weird bird up on a branch, and that made sense to me. For a while, anyway. I kept looking back at the eyes because I got the weirdest feeling that they were looking right back at me. In fact, I was growing more and more certain of it. I asked my uncle why the bird in the woods was staring at me, and he turned to see for himself. That was when I noticed that the eye shine stopped seeming to look at me and started seeming to look at my Uncle Ned. I looked at my Uncle Ned too, and I saw he was frozen, as though he were very frightened of something. I looked back to the woods, and I saw that the owner of the eye shine was slowly but surely emerging from the trees. It was not a bird. The eye shine belonged to 2 eyes in the head of what looked like a ram, complete with ram's horns like nature's car bumpers up front and center. The main problem is that the ram's head was on top of what looked like a white Bigfoot body. Except for the backward-facing legs, that is. I thought it had dog's legs, but I later found out that it actually had cloven hooves, and I'll explain that in a minute. But my first impression was that this was an animal that was dog on the bottom, like Sasquatch in terms of its torso and arms, and then it had a ram's head on top. But it was all white, or at least a very light color. It was not an albino, as its eyes were dark and wild. They looked not angry, but manic or something. Frantic, maybe. As calm and slow as the body moved. That's how fast and unpredictable the crazy eyes darted around. Without warning, it screamed. Or bleated or something. It sounded an awful lot like a man shouting. It gave me goosebumps all over. One split second after that bellow, the thing charged furiously in our direction. Both of us screamed, but just stood there, not sure exactly what we should be doing. Why was it charging us? Could it really come through the wall into my uncle's house? Or would it injure itself in the trying? Those questions remained unanswered, as whatever had enraged the ram-headed monster was not us, but something past my uncle's house, off in the distance. All that time I thought it was staring at us. It had actually been staring at some prey, off in the distance past us. The ram, Goatman, raced by through the snow so quickly that he was just a blur. He left footprints behind that, I swear to you, smoked as though they were super hot. Both my uncle and I ran outside to see where the creature had run to. We could see his footprints leading off into the forest and disappearing. Each step was in the shape of a cloven hoof, and each one was steaming hot. My uncle leaned in to smell one of them and passed out right on the spot. I had to drag him inside and revive him. He came to, telling me stories of how he had been taken to an island where people are all employed by birds. He was never quite the same again after that experience. I have no idea what we actually saw that night. I'm only glad that it didn't seem to see us. The Kentucky sheep squatch goat. It's a big legend-tripping tourist attraction these days to go try and see the goat man who lives under the trestle in Kentucky. I actually saw it as a child, and I can tell you, calling it a goat man does not begin to describe this thing. It was not a goat that walked on its hind legs. It was like a horse-legged man covered in sheep wool that had a goat's head with devil's horns on top. In Greek and Roman legends, I think they were talking about these creatures when they wrote and drew satyrs and fauns. They were shown with horns coming out of their heads, little devil buds when they were young, and massive horns made for head ramming when fully adult. Sometimes they were shown with legs like an animal, and other times they were shown with human legs, but they were always a symbol of lustfulness and fertility. Not in Kentucky. This particular faun or satyr is not associated with fertility at all, but rather with the untimely demise of those who look into him. It seems people have gone up on the trestle looking for the goat man only to meet a sad end when a train goes by. There's nowhere to go up there when a train goes by. You shouldn't go there to look for the goat man or anything else. And I never did. Nobody I know ever did. But years before the legend began, as far as I know at least, I think I saw the actual goat man they were referring to in these stories. My father was driving us home from a Sunday with richer relatives in the country when our car got a flat tire. This led to my parents bickering, and I would always zone out when that happened. So while they screamed at each other, I was staring off in the woods we were stuck in. I think my parents would shout when they were scared, and that it would make them feel a little less frightened for some reason. That's just my theory. Maybe they were actually as frightened as I was to be stuck there in the middle of nowhere on a dark night. If they weren't, they soon would be. Dad was still not finished putting the new tire on when we heard what sounded like a man screaming like an idiot just inside the tree line. I mean, it sounded like a man, but nothing he said was a word, at least not in English. He just seemed to be shouting nonsense. Some of it was so ridiculous that under other circumstances, I would probably be laughing at the sounds this guy was producing. As it was, I was getting more and more thoroughly freaked out. Maybe there was a crazy guy in those woods, and maybe we had somehow unwittingly bothered him. My father finished his job with lightning speed and threw the tools back into the trunk, slamming it. He got in the car and started the engine before he even had his door shut. This car needed to sit there for 10 or 15 seconds before you started driving, or else it would conk out and drop dead right there. I held my breath as my father slowly pulled away from the spot, hoping this meant we were soon going to be miles and miles away from Screamy McScreamerson out in the woods over there, but it was not to be. We were to get to meet our mystery serenader after all. As Dad pulled the car back onto the highway, a light-colored, wool-covered monster man with huge devil horns on top of his head ran out of the forest and onto the road in front of us. The car engine, chose that moment to conk out. All three of us screamed at the engine and the woolly monster, which had already crossed the road and was about to run into the woods. Then it stopped and noticed us. It turned out it was just running past us. It wouldn't have even noticed us if we hadn't screamed. But we did scream. So now we had made it curious. It strolled over to our car as though we were an exhibit at the zoo, and we screamed a lot more. Dad tried to start the engine as Mom screamed at him to start the engine, which he informed her loudly he was already trying to do. The goat, sheep, devil man came over to me and we made eye contact for a long time. For some reason, every time I dream of this, the goat sheep's face morphs into the monster on the airplane wing from that old William Shatner TV episode. But that's not what it looked like in real life. In real life, it looked like the face of an insane goat. It had wild eyes and its tongue would fly all around, outside of its mouth, making ridiculous demon sounds. My father got the car started and I watched out the back window as the goat sheep man trotted after us half-heartedly for a while, then stood there, watching us drive off, bleating nonsense at us as we departed. As far as I know, nobody in my family ever had an experience like that ever again. I've not only never seen a goat sheep monster man again, I've never seen any kind of monster, or ghost, or UFO, or anything. I think the goat sheep was real because I'm not the only one who saw it, but I can't understand how it could exist without leaving some kind of evidence behind that science could analyze. Maybe Sasquatch could avoid detection because they are a very intelligent creature, but this goat sheep man was a blithering idiot in a quite literal sense. It blithered and it blathered all over the place with its eyes looking in different directions. I think it's a miracle it can survive a day without its tongue accidentally strangling itself. But I saw it, and my parents saw it. And after we screamed a lot, it noticed us too. It was definitely something real. I guess the only lesson I learned from this experience would be this. If you see a big, stupid goat sheep man, be quiet. Maybe it won't notice you. I saw the Lake Worth monster in 2018. When I was a little kid, the big thing here locally in the Fort Worth, Texas area was the Lake Worth monster. It was our own personal boogeyman, and it came with our own personal Bigfoot, which we even had a picture of published in the local newspaper. So as a little kid, I had absolutely no doubt that all these were real creatures like any other. Back then, I still used to believe the newspapers. As you can see from the photo, the Lake Worth Bigfoot was white and shaped like a monster from the Lost in Space TV series of that era. The original Lake Worth monster that was more famous locally, though, was supposed to be a sheep man, but with goat horns and scaly skin. How a witness could tell that it had scaly skin when it was covered in woolly fur, I have always wondered. But that was how it was supposed to look, furry yet scaly. This old newspaper photo shows where the monster was allegedly standing, and the dotted line depicts the path of the car tire he allegedly threw to scare humans away from his turf. It was a local legend that lasted at least through the 70s, as we would challenge each other to drive past the area. Okay, so fast forward to June 2018, and I'm driving to visit my mom, who still lives in our ancestral home, the place of my birth. Lake Worth is located midway between the very modern city of Fort Worth and the jungle that is the Fort Worth Nature Center. Keep that in mind. There is a dense, protected forest located just on the other side of the lake that's large enough that I bet dinosaurs could survive in there. I was driving through and all I saw for miles and miles and miles was trees. Trees, trees, and more trees. And then suddenly, I saw a huge monster from a nightmare standing in the middle of the road. I had to slam on the brakes. I skidded up to the monster, slowing down but unable to stop before hitting him. The creature just reached down and stopped my car's forward momentum with one hand. It stared through the windshield at me, and I stared out the windshield at it. This was a creature who stood on his hind legs over 8 feet tall minimum. He had horns and light-colored fur covering his head and his broad shoulders. His chest and arms were mostly uncovered in fur and looked scaly, like the skin of a light-colored lizard, or sort of like the skin of a bird under its feathers, if you've ever seen that. It had hair covering its midsection, and I couldn't see below. Some of the people I've described this animal to have suggested that I saw some kind of creature with mange. They say patchy fur and scaly skin can both be caused by mange. The trouble with this theory is that the parts of this monster's body that were or were not covered by fur were symmetrical. In other words, the fur was the same on both sides of its body, which either indicates that this was how it was naturally supposed to look, or else that the Lake Worth monster had a really good hairstylist. I was absolutely terrified, not knowing what was going to happen next. The monster completely surprised me by shouting loudly right at me. Then, he sort of ran and tumbled into the bushes. He was gone incredibly quickly, and I was in shock for some time from the shout it gave just before running away. I guess the shout was meant to discourage me from following him, but he didn't have to worry on that score. I floored the gas pedal, and I got out of there as fast as I possibly could. Rather than driving home that night, I stayed over and drove back in the morning. After all, in the daylight, it's a lot easier to see the giant goat men before they end up in front of your car.
Thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos, or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.